back to the story here. Like I hated running. Absolutely despised it, man. My wife was the runner, and there was just nothing that I enjoyed about it. Even going back, I look back at my college days, my senior year, we got a new coach, and he was really big into conditioning, and we had to like run like a mile under like 5 minutes, and like that was like the most miserable experience ever in my life, trying to run like a sub 5 mile just to make the team. I mean, we figured it out. We did it, but it was just miserable, man. It was just miserable. So I just, through those years, of young adulthood, becoming a parent, like I just never thought about running, never wanted to do it. And then my dad gets this diagnosis, and at the time I was working out at a local gym, like super early in the morning. I had my business. I had 5 employees I was managing. I had 2 young kids under 5. And a marriage, and then my dad gets this diagnosis. So my workout group was like one morning they were like, hey, let's just go for like let's start running, because I don't know, there was like some sort of challenge, I think, at the gym, or a cardio challenge. And all right, so we start running outside, and I remember, so this was early 2009, um, right after my dad had got his diagnosis. And my dad had a surgery. He was eligible for the Whipple. So December, he was mostly in recovery mode. So this was like January '09. And, being in New England, being in Connecticut, it's freaking cold early in the morning, going out at 5 o'clock in the morning, pitch black, and there's no lights. We're in the suburban area. You're dodging skunks and raccoons and squirrels early in the morning. And I just remember that like first run was like a mile. It was nothing, and it was like a cakewalk run. And I just remember coming back, and I was like, oh man, like this feels awesome. And I was like, oh, I think I could do this for my dad. Like today, I think I could help my dad out, doing this. And so it's just started to click. Like the running to me,
Hmm.
like it went from this thing that I hated, it sucked, I didn't enjoy it, didn't want to do it, to like, hey, like this is really cool, man. And like, whoa, like my thoughts are clear. Like I was like, all right, I got work, I got family, I got my dad. And so the running started to increase. My dad started his treatments. And during the same time, I sat down with my wife, my brother, his wife, and my mom and dad. And I said, all right, hey, like I run my own business. I have 5 employees. I'm going to be the chauffeur. Like I'll go to everything. And all I'm going to do is just drive mom and dad and naturally go into the appointments, but I'm just going to be there. And so I made that decision, with the family, that I would do that. My brother had a full-time job working for like a Fortune 500 company. He didn't really have the flexibility. My wife was a school teacher. My sister-in-law is a physical therapist, or occupational therapist, I should say. So she didn't have that flexibility. So I was like, hey, I'll do it, and it'll just help out, with mom and dad. Not that they didn't understand anything, but as I look back, hindsight being 2020, it was like the best thing. And I advocate to people, whether they're watching or listening, if you have someone who's going through a cancer journey, it's great to have a third set of eyes, because you see things from a different perspective. You have a different lens. You're not worried about, it's not your spouse. And I always kind of tell this, like, my dad was worrying about my mom was worrying about my dad, and I was just able to kind of listen to everything, but also see
Hmm.
things, right? And that was so powerful as I look back at the creation of Project Purple, and what I eventually decided to do. There was a lot of inspiration during that time, not only from my dad, right, but also from just seeing things from that different perspective and that different lens. So
What
saw
do
a
you mean
lot.
by that? What things do you think you were able to see that you might not otherwise would have been? Like if you were, more like in your mom's position, for example.
Yeah, well, there's cracks in the system. Like our healthcare system is like a disaster. And
Yeah.
I just realized, like, hey, if you don't know, like it's a don't ask, don't like, if you don't ask, you don't get.
Yeah.
And there's nothing, I'm not trying to like say like people are doing this purposely, but if you don't know what to ask for, they're not going to give it to you. And because the system is so overwhelmed and there's insurance and there's, you know, the way that doctors and nurses are compensated, there's certain things that they just don't, it's not like they give you a laundry list of like, it's not like going to like, I went and had tacos yesterday at this taco place and it was all like a la carte. Like you check off what you want and how you want it. That's not how cancer treatment works. Like you sit in the chair and they tell you this is how it's going to go. And then you either say, do you, and the doctors and nurses say, do you have any questions? And most people have a shit ton of questions, but don't feel comfortable asking them sometimes, or don't know what to ask for. And so I just saw that. And my mom is like, my mom is the rock of the family. Like my dad was very quiet. My mom, like she spoke her mind, and so she would go after the doctors and nurses, not in a negative, like nasty way. She would just ask a lot of questions. So I would see that, like sitting there and go, "Mom, like shut up." And she's like, "No, I'm not gonna shut up. Like you got to advocate for yourself. Like no one's gonna advocate for Daddy." And I was like, after the first couple appointments, I was like, "Hey, man, I'm just sitting here. I'm just gonna let this ride, and I'm just gonna see what happens." And there were times when I was like, hey, wait a minute, you didn't answer my mom's question. Like, can we go back to that? Like, I'd
Mm.
have to jump in. And so that's kind of, I think, where, being that third person, like, you're not so much emotionally like involved because like it's not your
Mm.
loved one that's going through it or you that are going through it, and you can just see things. And then there were other things that I saw, Jeremy, like with other patients. Like I was there to support my dad, but like I would see, like for example, and I've shared this example many times, my dad was doing chemotherapy, and usually in a lot of these settings there's four people to a room. They call them pods. There's some sort of number. It's like three, six, four, eight, depending on the size. Usually they like them smaller just because it's more private, intimate, and just makes for a better experience, right? Like no one wants to go do chemotherapy, and it's just a nasty place to be. So we were in a pod or a quad, and for us, when we used to do chemotherapy, I'll back up for a second. My mom, this was like a pilgrimage. The night before, my mom's making cookies to eat for us and for the staff. She's making chicken cutlet sandwiches. She's making lunch in the morning or at night. She's bottling her own water, drinks, and everything. My mom was so superstitious. Like she did, and I get it. Like some of the food's not as nutritious like at the hospital, right? So they, you come
Yeah.
in and they give you a menu, and we would just say like, hey, we're good, we got everything covered. um and so we were kind of the party. Like the nurses, when we came, would love seeing my dad on the schedule because they knew they were getting like fresh batch of Italian cookies, which is insane, right? So, and then naturally we would bring lots of food and stuff because when my dad was doing chemo, he was there for about nine. It could go anywhere from 8 to 10 hours, so it was a long day.
Jeez.
So I just remember like this one incident. We're there. We're getting to know everyone. My dad's getting settled in, and you usually talk to the other people, right? Like and sometimes you're in there with people who have the same disease, which is cool because you could, the patients can talk about it, the caregivers can, you have this common bond, right? And I noticed like one of the chairs was open about a half hour in to my dad's treatment. This guy comes walking in. Now he's got like a styrofoam container, a Coca-Cola, and he looks at the time like I was, late 30s. He looks like he's about as old as my dad. And he sits down, and the nurses are getting him set up, and he's like, "I'm so sorry." And he goes, "I had to take the bus. I couldn't get a ride here, and apologize. Like something was up with the bus." And he opens up the container, and it's like Chinese food, and he's got the Coke. And now I look over and I'm like, we got a picnic basket with chicken cutlets. The chickens were probably killed on Friday. This is a Monday. My mom made the sandwiches in the morning. We got water filtration from our house, from my parents' house. And, my dad got driven here by me, as his chauffeur. And this guy's coming off a bus, coming. in eating Chinese food, which, my mom would never allow us to, have like they had all these food trucks outside of Yale. So he probably got it at one of the food trucks, like have any of that vendor food. And he's drinking a Coke. And I'm like, what the hell is going on here? Now, hindsight being 2020, the transportation thing's nuts to me. And that's I've never been able to like find justification for that. The Chinese food was probably what he can stomach and its calories, right? Like, and it's high dense calories, right? So that was probably really good for him. But here I am thinking like, hey, my dad's got fresh chicken cutlets. Like, how can this be, right? The Coke, I was at that point, I'm thinking like, that's disgusting. That's all he can afford. But again, now knowing what I know now, like that settles a lot of people's stomach. And with chemo, you get
Mm.
nauseous. The guy ended up being my age, and he
Oh
had
wow.
he had brain cancer. He had a glioblastoma, and right then and there, I was like, man, this is effed up. Like, this is not right. But, so seeing things from that, like my mom wasn't paying attention. Like I would see things like that, Jeremy, where I'm like, how can anyone who's fighting cancer take a city bus? Like, that's wrong. Like, that should not happen. Like, people should have resources. How could this person who, again, battling cancer, be eating that food, right? Or drinking the Coke? And I'm like, that's just not right, man. And so that was like one of the stories I look back on. I was like, you know what, this whole cancer community needs help. And then you start looking at like the disease specific and pancreatic cancer. And clearly, my dad was this inspiration, right? He's always been the biggest inspiration for me for what we've done here. But, you look at the numbers and dollars and cents. I'm an entrepreneur. I've always looked at the numbers and dollars and cents in anything that I get involved in. And there just was no money in it. There was little funding. And that's why we don't have early detection. We don't have curative treatments. 1 in 5 are operable because we don't have early detection because most cases are detected, at stage 4, which means they're unoperable. So
Jeez.
I was just like, hey, like, there were other things that happened with the system, like for us trying to find like a specialist in pancreatic cancer. We at the time my parents lived 20 minutes from Yale, was like finding a needle in the haystack. Now, the one benefit, fast forward 13 years, there are more specialists in this disease, but the disease has progressed. So I think, it's kind of like they're following the money, right? Like there's a lot of money now in GI cancer. So clearly there's now more specialists. 13 years ago, that wasn't the case. And so that was kind of part of the frustration. I remember being at one of the meetings and I'm like, they were talking about like how, so for my dad, he had surgery, did chemotherapy. 6 months later, after the chemo, they were like, all right, you're good, no evidence of disease. And then in 2010, the cancer came back. And they were like, it's
Mm.
stage 4. But I was like, like at the time, like I had an iPhone and I'm like, I'm doing my emails. I'm doing all this. What do you mean? Like this cancer's back. Like we can't beat this thing. So, there was just like all these little things along the way. And at the same time, I started to run a lot again, given what was happening in my world. And the running just became so special to me, man. Like I'd go out and at the very beginning, it was like a 1 mile run, 2 mile run. And I remember we were out on this run one morning. And at that time, we were doing like 5Ks. And again, it was super positive. I was feeling good. I was like having really clear thoughts. And one of my run friends was like, "Hey, why don't we do?" And this was when my dad's cancer came back, so this was like 2010 in like April. And they said, "Why don't we do a 10K or a 5K for your dad, and we'll give the money to Yale." And I was like, you know what? That sounds great, but I think we could have more impact. I think if we do our own thing, and I actually there's an anecdotal story that goes with this. Around that same time, I had met with the folks at Yale, the development folks, and I said, "Hey, like, I want to give you guys $5,000. Can we put it towards research?" And they're like, "No." And I was like so pissed
Mm.
off at that time. Now, hindsight being 2020, what I know now, like to give a restricted gift, like to say like, "Hey, $10,000 or $20,000, I want it to go all towards the researcher, this person." most places and even us, like it's a $75,000 minimum to do that because the accounting that's involved, like you got to
Mm,
ensure that like all that money goes towards that person or that project, right? So I can see from Yale's perspective, like, they've got $1 billion endowment, they've got like, they get, multiple seven-figure gifts a year from various donors, but they're restricted, right? And that was kind of part of
yeah.
like, there was something a couple years back. I think when COVID happened, they were talking about how these schools were losing money, and they called out like these Ivy League schools for their massive endowments. And there was a great article, I forget where it was, but it said like a lot of the gifts are restricted. And there's a reason why they're restricted because they're specific in scope, but there are minimums to that, right? And now running a charity, like we can't say to everyone who wants to donate, and I'm not saying like $1,000 is a lot of money, but even $5,000 is a lot of money. But to put restrictions, just think about it. Like if everyone gave $1,000 and everyone wanted that restricted, you need like a staff of like 20 to kind of follow and make sure that
Right.
that is actually the case. But as I look back on that, like that interaction that I had with that person didn't do anything wrong. She was doing her job. Was part of my inspiration to say, hey, like, hey, they don't want my 5,000. Screw it. I'm going to do my own thing. Now, would I have done my own thing? I think so, but that was kind of a little bit of a push. Um, and so that's when I had this idea to start Project Purple in 2010. There's a historic race here in Connecticut, the New Haven Road Race, which is the U.S. Track and Field 20K Championship, and it's been around forever. And it was coming up on Labor Day, and I was like, you know what, this is a great opportunity. As kind of 2010 kind of went through, like my dad getting diagnosed in March, having this idea like in April, May, and then I was like, all right, we got June, July, and August to make this happen. And so I was really blessed and fortunate again to have my own business at the time. So, again took a step back to care for my dad, but I kind of like moved my passion out of insurance into like philanthropy and pancreatic cancer and running, for my dad. And so we launched in September of 2010 the New Haven Road Race, which is the race that we were the first time ever. I grabbed a bunch of friends and said, "Hey, like I'm gonna buy the t-shirts. We're gonna put Project Purple on the front. It's gonna say my insurance company on the back because that's who's paying for them. And who wants to run either the half marathon, the 5K, or the 20K or 5K? I think majority of people ran the 5K that day. And I think we had a group of like 27 on the lawn at the New Haven Green there, and there's this iconic picture with our old logo of us all standing there, and that was the first running event. And I wanted to use running because, again, at the time, it was like so positive for me. And when we had our first board meeting, I recruited some friends, family, strangers, to get involved that believed in like, hey, we could help people, battling this disease. And we were sitting around the boardroom, and we had this idea of like, all right, how do we raise money? Like no one came from, that was like the one thing I guess I look back, like no one was in philanthropy. They were all for-profit people. Some of them were
Mm,
entrepreneurs, which I think was important in the early stages because you want people that have like a similar mindset and that can
right.
build things. Like we built this. And some people were like, oh, we should do like a gala. We should do like a wine tasting. We should do this. And I was like, eh. And I was like, hey, I got this idea. And at the time, I was like getting up to like running half marathons, like training wise. I was like, what if we did 13 half marathons in 13 months and call it like the 13 and 13 campaign? And they were like, that's pretty good. Um, and I said, okay, all right. And I was really about awareness. I was like, hey, we really got to like shoot out of the cannon like right away and raise a lot of awareness. And how do we do that? So I was like, this is kind of catchy, and we could do races in different towns and different states and stuff like that. And I said, who's going to do it? And everyone like looked around, and there was like only like two or three runners, and then the other people were not runners. And there, someone I forget who it was. Maybe it was my buddy Tony Longo, who's been on our board since day one. He was my best friend growing up, and he's like, "Man, it's your idea. I think you should run with it." So I was like, "All right, yeah, I think I could do that." So we came up with that idea. We had to like plan everything, logistics and everything, and we launched in I think it was April of 2010 or no 2011. And I was like, all right. So I started to do this. I kind of mapped it out. I looked at, here in New England, and I was like, this could be pretty cool. So I started to market it. And then what ended up happening, Jeremy, was as we launched that, like one of my coworkers or ex-coworkers who lives in Boston was like, hey, why don't you come up to Boston and do the Dana Farber half marathon, like like the BAA half marathon, and it's in October. And he's like, I'll run with you. I was like, all right. And then another friend was like, hey, another guy that I knew, he's like, I'll do the Hartford half marathon with you in October, like the week before or the week after. So what ended up happening is I ended up running like all these races, man. Like
Oh
in
wow.
that, so what ended up being like it was supposed to be 13, in 13 months. And it ended up being like I ended up running like 17 races. 17 I ended up running like 17 half marathons. I ended up getting a spot for the Boston Marathon that in 2012, 7 days before the Boston Marathon.
Oh
And
wow.
at that point, I had never run past 13 miles. And I'll never forget this. I'm at Easter dinner with my wife and kids up in the Massachusetts because my wife's from Massachusetts from the Berkshires. And we're sitting there at Easter dinner, Easter brunch. And I get the call. And I said, okay, to the person who offered me the spot. And I said, could we raise money for Project Purple, or can you just go to pancreatic cancer, because it was for another charity. And the lady's like, yeah, we can make that happen. And I said, all right, let me get back to you. And so I remember leaned over to my wife. I said, hey, that was so and so. There's a spot in the Boston Marathon for me, but it's next Monday. She's like, it's the Boston Marathon. You got to freaking do it. And my wife's like, the family's like diehard, Boston Red Sox, Patriots. They're from Massachusetts. They live and die. Patriots Day is a big day for them. So I called the person back. I said, I'll do it. So I ended up doing the 2012 Boston Marathon. It was the hottest. I think it still might be the hottest Boston. Up until that point, it was the hottest Boston Marathon on record. I ran all the way through. I set so many PRs that day, and I ran all the way to the top of Heartbreak Hill to like mile like 21 or 22, and then ran, the next couple miles. But it was that experience that I realized, like, hey, man, I think there's something here with marathons. And we got into the New York City Marathon in 2012, so that fall, right? And then if you remember, like New York City Marathon that year didn't go because it was Hurricane Sandy that took the race out. And so we eventually did run that. And, that just, those two experiences just grew our marathon program. And I'll back up at that first board meeting when I had that 13 and 13 idea. I was like, yeah, we'll never do marathons. Like we'll never venture in there. Now we are, we're a major player in, the five largest world marathons.